afternoon and welcome to everyone joining us on the webinar today. Today, our topic is unconscious bias in the workplace. Are you biased? I do not know it. I'm Dr. Sandra Palmer of Above or Beyond, and I am so happy to be sharing with you this afternoon. So let's get right to it.
At Above or Beyond, we help organizations achieve success through our quantum transformation solutions. What's holding back your organization from achieving success? What's your biggest people challenge? What keeps you up at night? With 30 years of solid results working with the best, we are certain we can help you achieve your success. Some clients served include AIM Resorts, Cable and Wireless, Digicel, Heineken, Kraft Foods, L'Oreal Cosmetics, McDonald's, Nestle, Pepsi, Pfizer Drug, Ritz-Carlton, Sandals, Shell. We are your partners in transformation. We will provide powerful keynote address or motivational session, management consulting, executive coaching, business development, interventions to address critical human resource issues, change management interventions after mergers, acquisitions or downsizings, job satisfaction surveys, cultural and strategic alignment, executive hiring and psychometric assessments, customized workshops. For example, handling office romance and sexual harassment, team building, supervisory training, and customer service. Schedule your free consultation today. Above or Beyond can help. Above or Beyond, jm.com.
So, unconscious bias in the workplace. And I want to start by defining, as an educator, I like to break down my terms. Unconscious bias. So let's take unconscious. What does it mean to be unconscious? To be unconscious is to have interruption in our awareness, whether awareness of self or awareness of our environment or awareness of someone else. It's almost being like comatose, not being fully conscious, aware of what's going on around you. Think of someone who has had an accident or someone who is undergoing an operation and has just been given anesthetic and you're totally unconscious. Imagine that happening with the conscious mind, not being aware. And then bias. What is bias? Bias is prejudice, it's stereotyping, it's preferences. And these preferences, stereotypes, value judgments can be for or against. For or against a thing, a group, a person, right? So as we talk about unconscious bias, putting the words together, we're talking about an unconscious form of discrimination and stereotyping. Stereotyping is labeling persons who appear to belong to a group as all the same, based on things like race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, ability. And you notice I use the word ability and not disability. Ability, age, nationality, language, skin tone, weight, appearance, and the list goes on and on. Belonging to any of the groups that we call others, persons who are not like us, persons who we consider to be different. I don't know how many persons are familiar with Games of Thrones. If you are, you can just type yes in the chat. Did you watch that series? It was a global sensation. No, the others. If you remember the others, these were the outsiders from behind the wall. And they would have night watchmen to watch the wall so that the others would not come in. And the others would eliminate, stalk, kill. Um, okay, somebody's saying, yes, I love this series. Okay, great. And the others were different. The others looked like this. The others did not look like Ned Stark and his family. And so they were afraid of them. And I want you to think of, when you think of other groups, people who look different, things that are unfamiliar, maybe they cause us to feel fear because they're not a part of our in group, not a part of our in group. So look at your screen and you see some words there. You can read much faster than I can speak. As you read those words, what gender comes to mind in the workplace and what could be the possible title of this person? Just type it in the chat. What gender comes to mind? Supportive emotional health through caring. And what job title comes to mind? Okay. Second, when you see this one, what gender comes to mind without any deep thought? And what position comes to mind? Leader, provider, service strong. Based on the stereotypes and based on my research, I think you would agree with me that the gender that seems to align with supportive emotional helpful sensitive caring would be female, and the gender that seems to align with leader, provider, etc. would be a male. Probably the job title that would align would be HR manager on this side and maybe CEO or president on the other side. However, suppose we were to flip the descriptors. What happens when we meet others, when we come in contact with others who do not fit the label, who do not fit into the stereotype? How do we deal with this? How does this default thinking impact us? Does it hurt? Does it help? Can it hurt? Can it help? The CEO was told that it would be quite useful, for him to add a woman to the male leadership team. And, his response was, let's create a role called Vice President of HR. That sounds like a nice job for a woman. Do you see how that plays back into the earlier narrative of the terms and associations that come naturally to mind when we hear certain words? I'll give you another example. Take a look at your screen. Unconscious bias as it relates to race and ethnicity. We see a male, a black male, Asian looking female, and you can see the descriptors. And based on research, these are the descriptors that come to mind most readily. These are the associations that persons tend to make with the images that I'm showing there. I go on. So first we had a black male, an Asian female, a Latino female, white male, and you see the associations that research suggests that come naturally to the unconscious mind based on background, socialization, and so on. Now, if I were to do this and flip the script, what is to say that you could meet this person on my left who is rich, educated, well-mannered, enjoys leisure, and loves a game of golf? What is to say you could meet this person on the right who is poor, uneducated, aggressive, although he's smiling, athletic, and loves basketball. And I deliberately ensure that all my images were wearing a suit and all my images were smiling. So the clothing, the demeanor would not be what would be the differentiating factor in how we think about those persons. So something else is informing this. And that's something to think about. More persons think that they are rational and objective when making decisions. But is this really so? Bias is a weakness we all have developed as humans because the thing is that the brain uses previous information stored to make decision making less onerous. Can you imagine how hard it would be if every single chore, every single encounter with another human being, we had to think step by step what to say, what to do, and how to respond? It would be quite onerous. So the brain has created these shortcuts that have served us very well. However, making these millions and millions of information that comes at us, processing it in a useful way, we quickly associate some things with good and some things with bad, depending on the people, the group, or the things. But anytime we see those groups, people, things, or association, these things may come to mind readily. And, name, for example, a beauty bias. Some people may have hair color, something as simple as that, or, a halo effect, conformity bias, ageism, uh, color culture bias, without thinking about it at a conscious level. You look at these two images, what do you see? What are the associations that come to mind? And please feel free to type your responses in the chat. I'll share it with the rest of the group. So on the right is a black male, young male, and on the right is about the same age, both of them wearing the same type of dress. One has a hoodie on his head, the other has the hoodie, but not having it on the head. Just think, what associations come to mind? Who is in college? Who is probably calling a colleague to discuss the next appointment? Is one musician? Is one an entertainer? Is one in med school? Is one in third year at law school? Is one associated with a particular type of subculture, a drug culture? Just process and just, you know, what associations are coming to your mind as you think about, you see these images. So anytime we see people, groups, or things, associations come immediately to our minds in milliseconds without thinking about it. Now, the thing is that this shortcut can be quite useful. Most of the things we do repeatedly without conscious thought, not necessarily a bad thing, but any type of shortcut can have its pros and cons. Biases can harm some groups and they can protect other groups. So is there bias in the workplace? No, think about this. To ensure fair selection, you all get the same test. You all have to climb that tree behind you. So all the animals lined up, the dog, the elephant, butterfly, etc., they need to climb that tree. So we're saying everybody has the same test, but is that a fair test for each of those animals? Something to think about, something to really think about. I want to share with you a real world behavior to get across the point of how we unconsciously um, make decisions and allow our biases to feed into such decision making. I'll pick the example of names redacted versus names included. So back in 2005, some researchers at Yale did a study, and they wanted to know if there was any bias at all at play in selecting for certain positions in the police force. And they got a group of participants to select a chief of police, right? And what they found is that some of the applicants had more on the job street experience, while others had stronger educational backgrounds. And when people were evaluating male applicants, they shifted the job criteria to emphasize the importance of whatever credentials that male applicant had. They showed no such favoritism when evaluating female applicants and even tended to denigrate the importance of the female applicants' areas of strength. Now, when the names were removed from the applications and the resumes, and persons had to vet these resumes without the names, an interesting thing happened. Most persons tend to select what I would call the best fit candidate. And it so happened that these best fit candidates were not male. Now, what was happening here? Did something happen when the names were removed? So it was not clear what the gender of the applicant was. The research seems to say that, because there seemed to have been a pre-commitment as to who should be a police chief, maybe a male. Another example that I will quickly share with you is what happens in the case of research grants, especially in STEM, large business grants. We're seeing where the research is showing us that although we're having more than a half of the college educated women with PhDs since 2015, more than half um, graduating with degrees in areas like biology, biomedical, agriculture, natural resources, health sciences, uh, fewer women are progressing through the academic ranks. Interesting. So if you have more women graduating with PhDs in these areas, why is it that less women are progressing through the academic ranks? And numerous well-designed studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals shows that gender bias in science, discipline, and medicine is persistent today, despite decades of programs that have been designed to mitigate the problem. Even with orchestra auditions, for quite a while, women had a very hard time or would just not get into these well-known philharmonic orchestras. And it so happened that somebody had a brilliant idea and said, let us do blind auditions. Let us not see who it is who is performing for us, playing that flute or playing that viola. And it turned out that, yes, they started to get some women in, but not enough. Then somebody realized, hey, we know who the women are because we can hear the heels click, 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 click when they're walking in. So let us have all the persons auditioning take off their shoes. They should only enter the room wearing socks. And a very interesting thing happened. More women were being chosen. So even professionals, musicians who thought they had the best ear for music and they were picking the right candidate to fill these roles had a bias. And at a conscious level, they didn't believe that they did. They didn't think that they needed blind auditions, but everything changed when they did so. So, should we trust our instincts? Should we trust our instincts? Yeah. Should we trust our instincts? In such situations, maybe your default reaction should be something to be suspicious of. You know, Maybe you shouldn't trust your gut. Unfortunately, most employers tend to trust their gut over their heads. But what happens when we do that? The research on decision making shows that most business leaders don't know when to rely on their gut and when not to. And the same applies to other professionals like doctors, therapists. How do they engage with their patients? How do they engage with their clients? Does everyone get the same attention, the same quality of care, irrespective of the group called other that the person belongs to? Uh, Somebody's saying not always. Does that mean maybe they don't always treat everybody the same way, or maybe the biases are not there all the time? But the thing is that we can't just rely on our gut, because the shortcuts we realize may or may not serve us. For example, if you went to the same high school or the same university as someone else, you may likely hit it off with them in a meeting or hit it off with them in an interview. But just because the person is like you, just because the person went to the same school, university, college, does it mean that that person will do a good job? Just because someone is friendly, does that mean that that person has the skills required to do a technical job rather than someone else who's less friendly? Something to think about. So the research is clear that our intuition doesn't always serve us well in making the best decision. And scholars call the intuition a troublesome decision tool that really requires adjustments to function properly. And I don't think anyone would use a tool that requires adjustments to function properly. Would you use a measuring cup, a scale, a tape measure that you had to tinker with each time you're going to use it because you can't rely on it to give you the right reading? And that's what happens when we trust our gut and our intuition. It can be harmful to workplace diversity and can pave the way to bias in making hiring decisions. So structure is a good way to break this up. Numerous studies have shown us that structured interventions are needed to overcome biases in the workplace, whether systems, whether a predetermined approach, because it's unfortunate, but business leaders and HR personnel tend to over rely on unstructured interviews and other intuitive decision making practices that based on overconfidence will cause them to feel that they're better at decision making than they really are. And we find, that when we use intuition and gut feeling sometimes, rather than using analytical decision making tools, we end up with the worst outcomes. And that's not what we want at all. So instead of looking for similarities, who are in our in group, why not look for differences? Is that such a bad thing? Why not create structured interviews? Use a set of standard questions. Ask the questions in the same order to every applicant. Don't start chit-chatting and going off on a tangent because there is an area of congruence between yourself and that applicant. And I say avoid emotional reasoning. What is emotional reasoning? This is really a mental process in which you conclude that what you feel is true, regardless of the actual reality. So the reality is staring you in the face, but emotional reasoning allows us to conclude that what we feel is true. And because it is unconscious, we're not aware of it. We can see someone else doing it. We can see someone else behaving in a way that we think that's not fair, but it's very hard for us to see it in our own behavior. So intuition versus the gut versus using systems to make better judgments, I will go with that any day. So let's talk solutions. It's one thing to look at the problems, but how do we move forward? And the sad thing is that most of us will say that we have no biases. But is that true? The truth is that we all have biases. Now, how do we avoid being the emperor without any clothes? How do we check ourselves to ensure that no one suffers under our watch? And I think this is a good place to start observation. Start by observing how we respond to certain events and people. And then have the same type of encounter with persons on different sides of your biases. And then process your reaction and responses at a conscious level after the fact. Because it's hard to be aware of your unconscious bias. But after the fact, you can look back at your behavior and process it and ask yourself, how did you do? Did I treat both persons the same way? Was I much easier on the more attractive person? Was I more critical of the candidate who was darker? Was I more agreeable with the male employee who asked for a better assignment? Was I more favorable to discussing a salary increase with the male employee, but brushed aside the concerns of the female employee? Check yourself. When you make a snap judgment and not even realize it, oh wow, that came up for me. That's interesting. Where did that come from? It's paying attention to your own behavior. Why did I do that? Why did I say it? Would I have done it if this person was somebody else, if the roles were reversed? So we can change our behavior when we're more aware that our behavior is being influenced by stereotypes. Ability or disability. Describe or demonstrate how, with or without reasonable accommodation, you will perform the duties of the job. No, that's a direct quote from an interviewer, which is quite appropriate. So I am looking at disability not as a barrier, but wanting to see how is it that I could enable this person to get the job done, that disability will not stand in the way of their performance. So are we creating enabling spaces, or is it that we are denying access to persons who we put in a group called other? And in this particular case, it would be the group called disabled or not able-bodied. Take a look at the screen. Share with me in the chat, if you recognize this gentleman. Okay, so this is FDR. He was affectionately known as FDR, 32nd President of the United States. Yes, somebody just said it was FDR. Thank you. Right. So he was president of the US between 1933 and 1945. And if you remember back, at that point in time, two major events had happened. Coming out of the Great Depression and coming out of World War II. So there was World War I, coming out of World War II, and the Great Depression. And this gentleman is known for the infrastructure work that he got done in the US, getting people back to work. Now, for quite a long time, the press in cahoots with the White House and the FDR team hid his disability. So this person sitting in the Oval Office looking very presidential was totally paralyzed, permanently paralyzed from the waist down. You see, at age 39, he contracted polio and he lost the ability to feel below the waist. No, many persons, if they knew that, probably would not have voted for him, would not have seen him as somebody who could lead the country, especially at that time. Not having an able bodied person leading the country after the Great Depression and after World War, then you see him on the other side in his wheelchair. No, after a while, yes, persons were aware of the fact that he was disabled, but think about his role, his work, and the legacy. And think about how we may or may not think about persons with disability. This other person here, who is this one? Hey, yes, this is Stephen Hawking. Now, Stephen Hawking is a global English theoretical physicist and a cosmologist. He developed ALS, and ALS is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And what is this disease? It's a neurodegenerative disease that affects nerve cells and the spinal cord. And when he was like 19, his friends would just lift him up and carry him to class at Oxford. And as he got older and the disease progressed, he lost his voice, his ability to speak, his ability to eat on his own. He had to be food fed. He could not care for himself. However, when this man died, at 76 years old in 2015, he was the director of research at the Center for Theoretical Cosmology at the University of Cambridge. And for emphasis, I say he was the director of the Center for Theoretical Cosmology at Cambridge, one of the top UK universities. Yes, this gentleman has written several books. His best known book is A Brief History of Time. Over 10 million copies sold, translated into 35 languages. He has been in Star Trek. He has been on The Next Generation, The Simpsons, The Big Bang Theory. And a movie was made on his life, which won an Oscar in 2014. Now, I'm sharing this with you to press pause for us to reflect and see, are we being fair in how we treat persons who belong to the group other, in this case, other being not able-bodied? Look at the accomplishments of these two men who are considered a part of the group other. Are we actually leaving people out? Are we losing much of the human potential that exists because of our natural biases? Where is the professor? You may or may not recognize that person on the screen. That's your presenter. Um, and it's interesting that in order to impact our awareness and to change behavior, we need to be exposed to counter stereotypical exemplars. And as a Black female professor, students' mere exposure to me means that the next time they go into a classroom with a Black woman setting up, they won't automatically ask the question, where is the professor? Several semesters at the beginning of the semester, the first day of class, I'll be there setting up, a student will walk in and look me straight in there and ask, where is the professor? I'm like, I'm right here. So it depends on what is it that the professor, should look like. Should the professor be male? Should the professor be white? Should the professor be in glasses, bearded? Whatever the question might be, questions to ponder, questions to ponder. It starts with us, with each person. Do my unconscious biases impact how I treat people? who are overweight, for example, do we feel, wow, they eat too much? Do we feel, oh, they're lazy? Could it be something that they have no control over? Could it be an illness? Could it be a disorder? People who do not worship the way I do, or people who do not worship at all. People who are short, female politicians, female leaders, do we hold them to a different standard? Male caregivers, questions to ponder. Less attractive people, do we treat them less? People without perfect teeth, white or light skinned people, dark skinned people, people over 50 years old applying for a job, people with gray hair. Do we treat persons differently without realizing? Questions to ponder. Now, accidents result in assets or liabilities. What do I mean by that? The fact of the matter is that most of the stereotypes and the biases and the groups that we put people in, these people did not choose these things. Most of these attributes are accidents of birth. Where you were born, this black girl, this white girl, where you were born, the attributes you were born with, you didn't choose these things. You didn't choose race, you didn't choose language, you didn't choose nationality. So if you were born on a continent far away and you happen to have been born in a skin like mine, then that could be a liability. I didn't choose this, I didn't choose my face, I didn't choose my hair, neither did I choose my skin. Neither did you. Now, others are a result of persons' ability to pay or access to resources or years lived. Perfect teeth, for example. What beautiful teeth. No. Did this person end up with perfect teeth because they were born with perfect teeth? Their parents had money, so they were able to pay for braces to correct whatever abnormalities were present or to close any gaps that they had, any spaces. Questions to ask ourselves. Do we give people a pass? Do we hold persons to a different standard because of accidents of birth? Do we convert these accidents to assets in one case, or we convert them to liabilities in another case? It's logic. It's logic. Most people think they're less biased than average. Just as we can't all be better than average, we can't all be less prejudiced than average. So I think it's probably safe to say that we all have some amount of prejudices. We all have some amount of biases. So admitting and demonstrating that we all have biases, we have to come up with ways to stop the unconscious bias virus, I call it, from infecting our workplaces and our communities. We have to take a personal inventory of our own biases. Some say it's not the responsibility of the oppressed or the victim to solve the problem or educate the oppressor. What say you? Whose responsibility is it? I'd be interested to hear what you have to say in the chat. Is it the victim's responsibility to be always explaining? Is it the oppressor's responsibility to educate themselves? I remember listening to a program on the BBC, and a caller said, I'm calling in because I'm listening to your program and I'm intrigued and I have a confession to make. I'm actually quite ashamed, but I want to say this to you, that whenever I am walking down the road and I see a male approaching me, a black male approaching, I cross the road. And I am thinking about this and I'm asking myself, why do I cross the road? If I saw a white man coming up the road, I would not have crossed the road. And, she said she felt really bothered by this. What was fueling this behavior in her? And the host, who happened to be black, said, I am so happy that you called because now we can have a conversation. Do you know that when I am walking down the road and I see a white woman, I actually feel anxious because I think she's going to cross the road, and I'm just a normal person going about my business, you know. And I feel that I have to explain myself every time I leave my house because of the skin that I am in. I didn't choose this skin, and I thought it was quite enlightening for them to have that conversation, because the fact is that when we understand someone's story, we see them differently, because there is no one story. We hurt others, we make incorrect decisions, not judgment, when we use one story to paint individuals and put them in a single box and label them as the other, whatever other may be. So we can't change what we tolerate. We have to keep working at it. There is benefit to unconscious bias. Some people say it doesn't work, but at least it creates awareness. It causes us to start thinking about ourselves and where we could be failing. No, real listening always brings people together. Once we start listening to each other, it definitely brings us closer together. Trust that meaningful conversations can change our organizations and our communities. If you do what you've always done, you will get the very same results. It was Einstein who said only a person who is insane will continue to do the same things and expect a different result. Another thing I suggest that we do is understand and recognize privilege. We all have privilege, whether it's gender privilege, being male, there is something called male privilege. If there is, it's privilege because you belong to a certain class, a certain race, a certain ethnicity, you went to a certain college, a certain university. Privilege. Understand your privilege, accept your privilege, but it should help you to realize how others may be treated who are not so privileged. Understand your biases as well. Where do they come from? What informs such biases? We won't solve unconscious bias in 2021. Neither will we solve it in this one single session, but we can drive change, leaps and bounds beyond what we have accomplished already with new approaches. If each person does his or her part in the process, we can sidestep the bias that has shaped our institutions and relationships for too long, and finally realize the change required for both stakeholder value and get into a society of more equal representation. It's about representation, it's about access, it's about opportunity, it's about belonging, it's about being invited to the party, it's about being asked to dance, and further, it's about being asked to take your own playbook with you. I'm just going to my chat and I am seeing some of the comments there. Haley says, I agree that there isn't one story. When you mentioned that you worry that a white woman will cross the street when they see you in today's world, it may be that they would cross the street for every person because of the pandemic. Yes, I agree with that. That very well could be the case. That's the reason why they could be crossing the street. But this man was saying in the particular case, the point I was making, that he actually felt that he had to basically be making an excuse or explaining himself just for who he was because of how he looked and the skin that he shows up in. So there's quite a bit that we can unpack, and there is quite a bit that we each can do individually to make the workspace and the workplace more inviting, more welcoming of the others. And I say the others because when people are not like us, uh, we may feel uncomfortable because it's easier to be comfortable with those who are part of our in and unconscious bias, you know, removing prejudice as much as possible. I would end by saying it's not a political statement. It's it's not just doing what seems to be current, but I would want to say it's doing what is right. It is doing the right thing. And it's also good for business. It's also good for business. So unconscious bias training really helps us to learn to create empathy. What is empathy? Putting ourselves in the other person's shoes, knowledge, being informed about the past, history, the present, somebody's experiences, their headwinds, their tailwinds, and understanding of people as individuals and not just putting them in a group. I thank you and I hope you found the session useful. Do enjoy the rest of your afternoon.